It was the 2nd of September 1995, Labour Day weekend in Toronto, and the shoreline of Lake Ontario was alive with excitement as thousands of spectators looked skyward, waiting for another performer in one of North America's most celebrated air shows. Out over the lake, a grey aircraft emerged from the haze, sunlight glinting from its broad wings. It wasn't a nimble fighter or an acrobatic display jet. This was something altogether different. Long, sleek and purposeful, a machine designed not for spectacle, but for vigilance and endurance. To many in the crowd, it was a rare and impressive sight. As it swept gracefully past the waterfront, few realised they were watching one of the Royal Air Force's most respected aircraft, flown by a highly experienced crew. But, within minutes, every one of the 7 men aboard would be dead. The aircraft wouldn't explode in mid-air or suffer a catastrophic engine failure. Instead, a chain of seemingly small decisions would combine with the unforgiving laws of aerodynamics to produce a tragedy that would fundamentally change how the Royal Air Force approached display flying. This is the story of RAF Nimrod XV239 and of the crew who were flying their last display. The Nimrod's origins stretched back to one of aviation's greatest triumphs and one of its darkest lessons. In the early 1950s, Britain introduced the de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner. It was revolutionary, but a series of catastrophic crashes caused by metal fatigue nearly ended its story. Instead, the redesigned Comet found a second life. During the 1960s, the RAF adapted its proven airframe into a long-range maritime patrol aircraft. The result was the Hawker Siddeley Nimrod, affectionately known as the Mighty Hunter. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Spey turbofan engines and packed with sophisticated sensors, the Nimrod became one of the most capable maritime patrol aircraft in the world. Its primary mission was seldom glamorous. It was an aircraft built for endurance rather than excitement, with some sorties lasting 10 hours or more. The crews often joked that the hardest part of the job wasn't finding submarines, it was staying awake while doing so. But beneath that dry humour lay extraordinary professionalism. Flying low over the North Atlantic in winter weather demanded exceptional skill, which forged crews who trusted one another implicitly. And by 1995, the Nimrod had become one of the RAF's most respected workhorses. The aircraft chosen to represent the Royal Air Force in Canada was Nimrod MR2 XV239. Like every military aircraft, XV239 carried the marks of thousands of flying hours, but she had brought crew after crew safely home again. There was nothing to suggest this flight would be any different. Military accident reports have a habit of reducing people to ranks and surnames, but aboard sat 7 individuals. At the controls was Flight Lieutenant Dominic Gilbert, aged 31. Beside him sat Flight Lieutenant Glenn Hooper, aged 25. Behind them worked Flight Lieutenant Bernie Worthington, aged 37, the Air Electronics Officer, Navigator Flight Lieutenant Nick Brooks, aged 26. Keeping the aircraft's 4 engines operating exactly as required was Sergeant Gary Moxham, aged 32, the crew air engineer. Also aboard were Sergeant Richie Williams, aged 28, and Sergeant Craig Barnett, aged 32, air electronics operators, whose everyday work involved monitoring the sophisticated equipment that made the Nimrod such an effective maritime patrol aircraft. 7 may seem a lot of crew for a display rather than a tactical mission, but it was the minimum required by RAF rules for the Nimrod. 7 careers built on professionalism, but not one of them could have known they were about to fly their final mission together. On the 23rd of August 1995, XV239 departed RAF Kinloss in Scotland for a goodwill tour of Canada. The visit was intended to strengthen ties between 2 close allies while showcasing one of Britain's most capable military aircraft. Their first appearance came at the Shearwater International Airshow in Nova Scotia. Thousands watched as the large maritime patrol aircraft performed a carefully choreographed routine, demonstrating that despite its size, it could be flown with surprising grace. The display lasted approximately 4.5 minutes and was a great success for which the crew were praised. From Nova Scotia, XV239 travelled west to Toronto for the Canadian International Airshow. Held annually over Lake Ontario, the event attracted enormous crowds. Flying over open water offered a measure of safety should anything go wrong, while the dramatic backdrop of Toronto's skyline created unforgettable images for spectators. The Nimrod would perform alongside fighters, aerobatic teams and historic aircraft from both sides of the Atlantic. For the RAF crew, it was another prestigious engagement. For the crowd, it promised an unusual spectacle. Display flying is unlike operational flying in almost every respect. Operational crews are trained to accomplish missions safely and efficiently, but display crews must do all of that while creating something visually impressive. Yet every manoeuvre exists within strict safety margins. Those margins are there for one simple reason. The aircraft does not know it is putting on a show, and the laws of physics remain utterly indifferent to applause. The Nimrod display had evolved over many years and consisted of a series of sweeping turns, low passes and climbing manoeuvres intended to demonstrate the aircraft's capabilities without venturing anywhere near aerobatics. It had been flown safely dozens of times, and perhaps that very familiarity bred confidence. Confidence is not the same as complacency, but history has shown that confidence, left unchecked, can quietly erode caution. The aircraft arrived in Toronto on the 30th of August, and on the 31st flew a media demonstration over Lake Ontario and Niagara Falls. On the morning of the 1st of September, the flight deck crew and some of the rear crew did a live interview for local TV, before returning to the Regal Constellation Hotel. That same day, the entire crew, except for Dom Gilbert, went to visit several children's hospitals and Cheshire disability homes. Gilbert, Hooper and Brooks would later spend a relaxing evening having dinner at a restaurant opposite the hotel. The following day consisted of briefings, breakfast and rest, before departing for Pearson International Airport, their display base. Maintenance records showed no significant defects, and the aircraft was considered fully display ready. As spectators filled the waterfront on that warm September afternoon, XV239 taxied into position. The crew completed their final checks, the engines spooled up smoothly, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. At 15:01, it was climbing into a cloudless Canadian sky. No one watching, not on the ground nor aboard the aircraft, could have imagined that this routine demonstration was already drifting towards catastrophe. The opening two passes unfolded exactly as planned. XV239 swept gracefully along the display line before banking gently out over Lake Ontario. Its distinctive silhouette drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Everything appeared textbook. Then came the first of the so-called dumbbell manoeuvres, a sweeping climbing turn away from the crowd before returning along the display line. Again, the aircraft behaved perfectly. Inside the cockpit, the workload increased as power settings, flap selections and navigation calls came in rapid succession. Then XV239 began setting up for the second dumbbell turn. To those watching from the shoreline, it looked no different from the first. To the crew, it was simply another manoeuvre in a routine they had flown before. The Nimrod did a slow flypast at about 140 knots, with its undercarriage down and flaps at 40 degrees. To everyone watching from the shoreline, she still looked composed. But aerodynamics often conceal danger until the very last moment. Every aircraft has something pilots call an energy state, a combination of speed, height and engine power that determines how much room there is to manoeuvre. Lose too much of any one of those and the others must make up the difference. During the second dumbbell turn, that balance began to unravel. The aircraft rolled into a steepening right-hand turn as Flight Lieutenant Dom Gilbert positioned the Nimrod to bring it back along the display line. As planned, the landing gear had been retracted after the earlier low pass, and the crew were configuring the aircraft for the climb. Then the engines were throttled back to idle. This wasn't a malfunction, it was an intentional part of the display profile, intended to keep the aircraft's speed under control and present a smooth, graceful manoeuvre to the crowd. But as the power came off, the airspeed continued to decay, and investigators would later determine that the aircraft slowed to around 122 knots. The recommended minimum for that stage of the display was 150 knots. On paper, 28 knots may not sound like much, but in aviation it can be the difference between controlled flight and catastrophe. Because there was another invisible factor at work. As the aircraft turned, it was also pulling approximately 1.6 times the force of gravity. Most people think of a stall as something that happens when an aircraft simply flies too slowly, but that's only part of the story. In a turn, the wings must produce more lift to support the aircraft against the increased G-load. The harder the turn, the greater the lift required, and the faster the aircraft must fly to produce it. In effect, the turn itself raises the stall speed. XV239 turned left back towards the display line at a bank angle of about 70 degrees, which then lessened to about 45 degrees, with the nose now dipped below the horizon. The speed increased slightly, but not enough, and the combination of low speed and increased G-load caused the aircraft to stall. As this happened, it caused the left wing to drop to about 85 degrees of bank, and the nose pitched further down. Almost instinctively, full right aileron was applied and full power was demanded. The engines did spool up, but jet engines do not produce maximum thrust instantly. Even the superb Rolls-Royce engines needed precious seconds to respond. Seconds the crew no longer had. Spectators who had been casually following the display suddenly realised something was terribly wrong. Then came the horrifying realisation that the aircraft wasn't climbing again. It was falling. At approximately 15:27 in the afternoon, XV239 struck the waters of Lake Ontario, nose down and at near wings level, 9 seconds after the stall. The impact shattered the aircraft into several major sections, which sank immediately, and 7 RAF airmen lost their lives in an instant. For the thousands gathered along Toronto's waterfront, the festive atmosphere vanished in seconds, replaced by stunned silence. Emergency crews reacted straight away. Within minutes, craft converged on the impact site, which was marked by floating debris where the aircraft had disappeared beneath the surface. Divers entered the lake, hoping against hope, but sadly, the violence of the impact had left no possibility of survival. Over the following days, recovery teams worked methodically to locate the wreckage and recover the bodies of all 7 crew members. Across the Atlantic, families who had expected their loved ones home instead received the visit that every military family dreads. The Royal Air Force had lost not only an aircraft, but an entire crew. At RAF Kinloss, colleagues struggled to comprehend the news. Many had flown with the men aboard XV239. Others had watched them depart for Canada only days before. Whenever an aircraft crashes before thousands of witnesses, speculation spreads almost as quickly as the news itself. Had an engine failed? Had a bird struck the aircraft? Was there a structural problem? Some spectators even believed that they had heard the engines lose power, but as we know, they had been purposely throttled back. Subsequently, television footage was replayed repeatedly, each viewing generating new theories. Investigators, however, resisted drawing early conclusions. Instead, they followed the evidence. The wreckage was painstakingly examined and flight data reconstructed. Slowly, a picture emerged. The Board of Inquiry reached several conclusions that surprised many observers. There was no evidence of mechanical failure. XV239 had not betrayed her crew. Instead, she had obeyed the immutable laws of physics. When the aircraft slowed below the speed required for the amount of lift being demanded in the turn, the stall became inevitable. In other words, the aircraft had done exactly what every aircraft will do when asked to fly beyond its aerodynamic limits. At first glance, that sounds like a straightforward case of pilot error on the part of Flight Lieutenant Gilbert, and sadly, that formed a large part of the board's findings. But the investigation refused to stop there, because simply blaming the pilot answered one question, while ignoring a far more important one. Why had an experienced RAF display crew been allowed to reach that point in the first place? This is where the story of XV239 becomes about much more than one flight. Investigators discovered that the Nimrod display program had evolved gradually over many years, but there was no approved formal training syllabus. Unlike today's highly structured military display training, much knowledge had been handed from one crew to the next, with training continuing until a satisfactory standard was achieved. Each new display captain learned the routine from instructors and an experienced Nimrod display pilot. The Board of Inquiry determined that whilst Flight Lieutenant Gilbert was an experienced pilot who should have known the theory behind important aerodynamic factors, the display of a large aircraft like the Nimrod required a full understanding of the practicalities of these issues. Accordingly, the board determined that the incomplete training of Nimrod display flight deck crews was a contributory factor in the accident. The findings prompted the Royal Air Force to take a hard look at its display flying procedures. The Nimrod display program was fundamentally restructured, with future display crews receiving far more formal training. Display profiles became more rigorously defined and monitored, and greater emphasis was placed on preserving adequate energy margins throughout every manoeuvre. The changes reflected a growing understanding that professionalism alone is not enough. Even highly experienced crews need systems that protect them from gradually drifting beyond safe limits. The purpose of procedures is not to constrain good pilots. It is to protect them on the one day when experience, confidence and routine are no longer enough. Each member of the crew wore the uniform of the Royal Air Force with pride. Each had dedicated years to mastering a demanding profession, but they were caught in a chain of circumstances that revealed weaknesses extending far beyond one cockpit, with devastating consequences. Eventually, many years after the crash, the vertical stabiliser of XV239 was returned to the UK from Canada and is now a centrepiece of a memorial at the Moravia Museum at Kinloss. The memorial gives the details of those lost in 3 separate Nimrod crashes, including XV239. These losses continue to be remembered by former colleagues, friends and family, and by the squadrons that still honour their service. And our condolences go out to the families of all those who lost their lives. But before I sign off, can I say this story is a little different for me? During my own service as an RAF officer, I met the navigator of XV239, Flight Lieutenant Nick Brooks. This was through working with his brother Jason, who was in the same RAF branch as me. I didn't know Nick well enough to tell his life story, and I won't pretend that I did. But I knew him well enough that this isn't just another historical accident. For me, it's the story of someone who once wore the same uniform I did. That makes it all the more important to tell this story as accurately and respectfully as I can. Now, despite the tragic loss of life, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.